You know what? Praise God. Good morning. We're on the second Sunday of a four-part series focusing on stewardship and generosity. And the overriding theme we're working with in this area is this. Are you ready? You heard it last week. We're going to hear it again this week. Disciples of Jesus Christ are faithful to God in stewarding all that he owns by disadvantaging themselves in order to advantage his kingdom. Now, last week we looked at the context of stewardship. We learned that our covenant relationship with God is the context in which Christian stewardship can thrive. And we learned that a covenant relationship is characterized by loving kindness and loyalty, love and loyalty. We learned that covenants have both an individual and a corporate aspect to them. We learned that a personal relationship with God is really a covenantal relationship, and we saw how that relationship leads us into being covenantal relationships with each other. We learned that salvation is really believing loyalty in God. We don't switch gods. And we were encouraged to learn that since we can't earn our salvation through performance, we can't lose our salvation through lack of performance. And we learned that the new covenant that we have here in the New Testament enables us to be faithful to God because he transforms us from the inside out by writing his law into our minds and in our hearts. But we also noted how we can short circuit or disconnect that transforming work. And we looked at a penetrating question last week, and it was this: will you participate in the new covenant by allowing God letting God fully write his laws into your mind and your heart? Applies to me too, right? So today, last week was the context of stewardship. Today is the foundation of stewardship, okay? And we're going to learn 5 foundational truths upon which Christian stewardship is based. So if you have your Bibles, open them up to Matthew 25, verse 14. Your smartphone, your Bibles. And let's read this together. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servant and entrusted his property to them. To the one he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. Now the man who had received the five bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. So also the one who gained 2 bags of gold went out and gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag of gold went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received the 5 talents brought the other 5. Master, he said, you have entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. Here's 5 more. Master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's presence. The man with the 2 bags of gold also came back and said, Master, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. Master replied, well done, good, faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's presence. But the man who had received 1 talent came. Sorry, I lost my place. Verse 24, then the man who had received 1 talent came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered. So I was afraid, and I went out and hid your talent in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked and lazy servant. So you knew that I had harvest where I had not sown and gathered where I had not scattered seed? Well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. Take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags of gold. For everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. And throw that worthless servant outside into darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. May God bless the reading of his word. Let me set the context here just a bit. First of all, I have heard this preached on more than one occasion where what the parable is really about is spiritual riches that have been created by people performing spiritual acts of service. And the economic piece of this is either downplayed or ignored altogether. But when you read this in the Greek, the key words that are used are economic and monetary words. For example, the Greek word that we translate bags of gold, or in some of your translations as talents, really refers to a unit of weight and measurement in the coinage of money. The sense of the word is a large monetary measurement, kind of a lot of money. In other words, there's a certain weight of a valuable metal. In addition, when the master says that the wicked servant should have taken his money and put it in the bank to earn interest, that word for interest is literally an economic word. It's a monetary word. It means the profits arising from lending money. Okay? So the passage doesn't make sense if we're only talking about spiritual gifts. You can't take spiritual gifts and put them in the bank and earn interest. You can't take a spiritual gift and somehow double your gifting in the marketplace, can you? No. Instead, it's right to see this parable as referring to real economic wealth and real economic profit, okay? We should also note that this parable assumes that creating profits are seen as an act of discipleship. Profits here created are not seen as evil or inherently bad. Now, in that context, let's dive in to the 5 foundational truths that we can learn about stewardship. First of all, the first foundational truth, number 1, God owns everything. Okay? Go back to verse 14. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To the one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. There's no doubt that the master here owns the money. And his servants use his money to create and generate real wealth. The servants didn't go to the bank and invest their own money. It was the master's money that they went out into the marketplace and they doubled it. They used the master's money to create profit. Now, this idea that God owns everything is also clearly stated in other passages in the Bible. Let's look at Psalm 50, verses 9 through 12. This is God talking to the Israelites. I have no need of a bull from your stall or goats from your pens, for every animal in the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains, the insects in the fields, they're all mine. And if I were hungry, guess what? I wouldn't tell you, because the world is mine and all that is in it. Psalm 24, verse 1 says this, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. God owns everything, and if he owns everything, then it stands to reason that he owns your business, your money, your wealth. He owns your house, your cars, your cabin, your season tickets, your investments, the dishes in your cupboard, the food in your cupboards, right? He owns your furniture. He owns everything. Do I need to keep going down the list, or do you get the gist of where I'm going there? Now look, we may own that stuff in an American legal sense. I get that. But in God's economy, we don't own anything. Okay? Now, Christianity has some paradoxes in it. By the way, a paradox, if you know what that is, it's a seemingly self-contradictory statement that when you investigate it, it actually turns out to be true. So in Christianity, we gain by losing. In Christianity, we become strong when we become weak. In Christianity, we become elevated by becoming humble. And, you know, the last will be first. It's those kind of paradoxes that exist in Christianity. They seem to be contradictory, but they're really not. Okay, this is another one. God's ownership is something of a paradox. Okay? You see, our culture highly values ownership, and it encourages us to claim ownership on everything we can. And it's not like we need encouragement to do this, right? Just watch little kids, and they get around toys, and what do? What's the phrase? That's mine. That's mine. That's mine. They take it from another. That's mine, right? We don't need to be taught to claim ownership over anything, right? That just comes naturally. But we think that by gaining ownership and control over things in our environment, we'll gain the good life, right? will gain the American dream. We think that we'll find happiness, we'll find financial security, we'll find what we're looking for, right? But the way we experience God's best for us is an apparent paradox. When we release ownership of what we have to God, we get back a real life of joy and real happiness. You see, we gain financial security by giving our money away. We find peace by trusting in God for our financial future rather than in our 401ks. We'll be more fulfilled when we buy less and give more away. We'll be salt and light by helping others who are hurting. And our church will be stronger when we're more generous. Not just financially, but spiritually. When we are generous with other people and our church, we release a spiritual power that isn't there when we hoard. And next week, we're going to look at hoarding in depth, okay? America says that the good life is to be the master of your domain, but God says the great life is to be a steward in God's domain. So let me reiterate the first foundation: God owns everything. Second foundation, God entrusts to us some of what he owns. Because God owns everything, he has the authority and the right to choose, he has the authority and the right to entrust the care and feeding of that which he owns to us. As a result, biblical stewardship views everything we have as an entrustment from God because everything we have is owned by God. This is two sides of the same coin, okay? Let's look at the parable again, especially verse 15. To the one he gave 5 bags, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. I'm going to come back to that ability comment next. The act of giving while maintaining ownership is a classic definition of entrusting. The master gave bags of gold to the servants, but he never relinquished his ownership of that gold. He simply entrusted it to them. Okay? Becoming a servant, a steward of that which God owns, goes against our natural tendencies. Our culture pushes us to be in charge, to pick yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? Or don't let others run your life now. Follow your heart. Do what you think is right. Don't let anybody tell you how you're going to live. And when we're in charge, we're living the good life. When we claim ownership, we're living the good life. But God says that there's a great life out there. God says there is a great life by becoming a steward. We can finally rest in God's sovereignty rather than having to have control. We no longer need to be burdened and work ourselves until we're weary. We come to God and he lifts those burdens off our shoulders. This is how we find the great life. We become a steward rather than an owner. And we steward well what he has entrusted to us. Now, in case you think this is only about material goods and services, let's look at 1 Thessalonians 2:4. This is Paul talking and writing to the church in Thessalonica, and he says this. It's almost a passing phrase, but he says, on the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. Let's not forget that God owns the gospel too. Okay? This is why when he decides to call people to preach or to share the good news of the gospel, he's entrusting them with the gospel. Okay? Now, entrustment of the preaching and the sharing of the gospel is a big deal. And it's followed by that great commission in Matthew 28, where we're to go into all the world and to make disciples, teaching them to obey everything that God has commanded. That is a huge entrustment to us individually and to the church at large. That's a huge entrustment. God owns his commands. He owns his gospel, and he entrusts those things to us, and he entrusts us to teach them to others. This spreading of the gospel, this making of disciples, these activities are highly important to God. Again, go read through Revelation and find out what's important in heaven, all right? And in Luke 16, verses 10 through 12, these activities are called true riches. That's how they're termed. And they are compared to worldly wealth. So let's take a look at these verses. Verse 10. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will entrust with you or entrust to you true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? See, the comparison that Christ is making here is between worldly wealth and true riches. The contrast is between that which is temporal and that which is eternal. Okay? Worldly wealth is temporal. It's the small stuff. Okay? The true riches of spreading the gospel, making disciples, growing the church, making the church strong, that's the true stuff. That's the true riches. It's permanent, it's abiding, hence the word true. True riches. So the point that Christ is making here is that if you are not trustworthy in how you manage worldly wealth, the temporal stuff, the small stuff, then how does God know that you'll be faithful if he entrusts to you the big stuff, the true riches, the sharing of the gospel, the making of disciples? If you boil this really down to common English, the comparison is this. If you're not living a life dedicated to God, then why would God give you opportunities to lead others in becoming dedicated to him? Now that might come across as a little harsh, and it's not meant to be that way. You know, I love you. I love you guys, right? But God's truth is sometimes a little tough. Sometimes God's truth needs to penetrate us and convict us a little bit. If you come to church just to feel good, man, you ought to come to church to let the Spirit convict you, to worship God, to fellowship with his saints, and to walk away energized, ready for the week, right? Here's the implication, that he's not going to take that chance. We must first prove ourselves faithful in the small stuff, the worldly riches, I think, before he'll consider giving us the more important eternal and permanent work of true riches. Now, this ties directly to our money management and generosity in our maturity to Christ. If you're not managing your money the way God would have you manage it, if you've not given control of your money and your wealth to God, then you're not being faithful to him in the small stuff, the worldly wealth. And God cannot entrust to you the true riches of sharing his gospel and discipling others. You'll get so far, and then you'll stagnate. You'll stop. You'll stagnate. This is why I've come to believe that the reason most Christians rarely sense God's presence or witness effectively or are able to be mighty in prayer or experience a deep and abiding presence with God is because they have not been faithful in the small stuff. This is the connection that we need to make. They haven't been faithful to God with their money, so God cannot entrust to them true riches. Now, if you're not being generous towards God, then it's likely you're not feeling or sensing God's presence. God won't entrust to you the true riches until you have surrendered your checkbook, your investments, your money to him. Until you see yourself as a steward instead of an owner, you will only progress so far, and then at that point you'll either stagnate or surrender. And you and I will never draw intimately close to God without first surrendering ownership of our wealth to him. Foundational truth number 3. God gives entrustments to us based on the abilities that he has given to us. Let's go back to that same verse again. To the one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2, to another 1, the phrase, each according to his ability. God gives us different abilities. Some of us create wealth by working for others. In fact, most of us create wealth that way, right? But some create wealth by employing others. A few of us do that. I've been on both sides of that. We each have been given abilities in this area, and one ability is not more important than the other. Now, America says that in order to have the good life, you must believe in your work and work hard to get all that you can. You got to believe in yourself. Push yourself to be all that you can, right? But God says that we need to find a great life by believing in him and letting his Spirit energize us to do what he is asking us to do. The great life is found in being faithful to God in our covenant relationship with him. God gives us enough abilities to accomplish all which he has called us to do. And so doing what God has called us to do is maximizing our abilities. Okay? America tells us to push ourselves until we have found the outer limits of our abilities. God says, just use the right mix and the amount of abilities and fulfill my call on your life. The great life is not found in discovering all that I can do. It is found in discovering all that God has called me to do. Okay? If we're talented, it's because God created us that way. If we're smart, it's because he gave us our intelligence. If we are creative, that's from God too. If we have significant opportunities to create wealth, that's from God. If we've inherited wealth, that's also the generosity of God. If we have a new product idea for a better mousetrap, guess what? That's from God. Okay? And so we learn to enjoy and celebrate our differences because within our covenant relationships with each other, and with God, we understand that together we're building God's kingdom and we're preparing to reign with him in eternity. So far we've learned three things. That God owns everything, that all we have are really entrustments from him, and he gives entrustments to us based on the abilities that he gave us. But there's more. We have a fourth and a fifth we're going to go over. Thank you for staying with me. I know it's kind of hard when I'm running through stuff quickly, but you guys are wonderful. Thank you for staying with me. Fourth foundational truth, stewards know their master well. Faithfully stewarding entrustments means we must know the master's heart and we must know him well because we represent the master to a lost and broken world. It's a representative role. So the relationship of the first two servants with the master was substantively different than that of the third servant. And the single variable between the first two servants and the third was their view of the master, was their character. Said in a different way, the two good servants had a healthy relationship with the master, and the third servant did not. Okay? We see this in how the third servant responded to the master. I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid. But you know what? The master wasn't a hard man. He wasn't oppressive. He didn't oppress his employees or take wealth from others unfairly. That wasn't him. He wasn't a difficult guy to work for. Instead, this was the excuse offered up by the wicked servant in the hopes of covering up his laziness. Lazy people, you'll find, always blame others for their lack of productivity. We know this. Verse 26. The master replied, "You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew," he's just going with the assumption here, "so you knew that I harvested where I had not sown and gathered where I had not scattered seed? Well, then the logical thing he's pointing out would have been that you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, and at least I would have gotten some interest back here." But the wicked servant was so lazy that he didn't even make the effort to go to the bank. Didn't even get up out of his chair to go to the bank. Something which would have been very easy to do. The wicked servant was just plain lazy. Had he taken the effort to get to know the master, I think he would have known what to do, even with the wrong assumption about the master. Now look, the application here is pretty obvious, is it not? Lazy Christians don't pursue God, and they don't make good stewards. They don't even make a minimal effort to get to know God. As a result, they develop wrong ideas and impressions about who he really is, and Satan uses that to slowly but surely kind of entice them away and to become unfaithful and to leave their covenant relationship with God. Taking time to pursue God, I believe, is a lost discipline in many evangelical circles today. We so often portray God as some type of cosmic bellhop whose main interest is in serving us and making us happy, that we forget that covenants are a two-way street and that God has already taken the initiative to connect with us. It's now our turn to take some initiative and connect with him. You see, people who live this great life, disciples of Jesus Christ who live not the American good life, but God's great life, these people do so because they are intentional about drawing close to God's heart. They know God well because they take time to know him. They love the Lord, and they grow more and more in their love for him. They avoid evil because they have set their heart on seeking God's face. Faithful stewards know that God rewards those who diligently seek him. They look to the Lord in times of trouble, and they depend on his strength. They understand his spiritual protection, which comes from walking closely with him. He becomes their refuge, in other words. They understand that when they ask him to do things in all kinds of situations, that they know they've touched his heart to do those things. They know and they listen to his voice. They confess their sins regularly. They delight in learning his law. They develop an intuitive sense of what God desires in a given situation, even if they can't point to chapter and verse. When they pray, you can sense God's anointing in their prayers. They love the fellowship of other Christians. They're drawn to the Lord because of their walk with God. They enjoy the sweetness and the presence of his presence. They enjoy the beauty of his holiness. They enjoy the discernment of the Holy Spirit. They understand the power of his protection. They know the leading of his voice. They feel his pleasure. And there is nothing in this world they would trade for those true riches. Nothing. It's not for sale. They have traded the American good life for the great life, which we can find only in our covenant relationship with God. And when you meet this people, I promise you, to a person, you will find that they are generous. To a person, they are generous. You will never find somebody that I just described who is hoarding and not generous. You will never find that. Now, before we go on, I just want to encourage you a little bit here. If you have set yourself up to pursue the heart of God, if that's what you're going to do, then give it time. Give it time. I think you'll find that he will give you his heart in proportion to how you allow him to transform your heart. I'm going to pull that from the last sermon to today. I'm going to pull that through to right here. If we allow God to fully write his laws into our minds and our hearts, then as we allow him to transform us, we will find that we can really seriously connect with God. He will disclose himself to us in proportion to how much we allow him to transform us. Isn't that something? This is the great life that God offers, to know his heart. Man, I tell you, what a joy. Foundational truth number 5. Here we go. If we are faithful to God, we will reign with him throughout eternity. And we don't talk about this often in Christian circles, but it's especially in the book of Revelation, it's really, really prominent. Okay? Let's look at the parable one more time. How does the master congratulate or give affirmation to the two faithful servants? He says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in a few things, the small stuff, right? You've been faithful in the small stuff. So I'm going to put you in charge of the big stuff, many things. Come and share in your master's happiness." So what was their reward? It was 2 things. What were those 2 things? First of all, they were put in charge of stuff that was a whole lot more valuable than money. Okay? And secondly, they were given more of the master's presence. Do you see that? There's this theme in the Bible which states that essentially if we are faithful to God, love and loyalty, here's the covenant here, if we're faithful to God until we die, part of our reward will be to reign with him in eternity. And we will do so in his presence, enjoying him and reigning over what he entrusts to us in eternity. Okay? This is also articulated in 2 Timothy 12, verse 2. If we died with him, Paul writes, we will also live with him. There's more of that paradox. We die in order for us to live. Okay? But if we endure, we will also reign with him. Okay? Hence, what we do on this earth, both in activity and in drawing close to God, are preparatory for reigning with him in eternity. For a disciple of Jesus Christ, our primary preparation on this earth is not to have a fulfilling career, even though that's really important in a lot of instances. You don't want your surgeons to not have gone through proper preparation. You don't want your pastors to not have gone through proper preparation, right? Sales, that's all right. They can go. I'm just kidding. All right. I did that because my good friend Al was in sales. But instead, we prepare on this earth to reign with Christ in eternity. Okay? We prepare to reign with Christ in eternity. And we do that by being faithful to him and learning to enjoy his presence here on this earth. Because we're going to have his presence in heaven, we better start enjoying his presence now. Kind of a foretaste of that which is to come, right? So if you want the great life that God offers, instead of just the good life that America offers, if you want the great life, then adopt an eternal perspective on everything you do. When we learn to hear his voice and follow his leading, we're learning to reign with him. When we draw close to him, we're preparing to reign with him. When we represent him well to a lost and broken world, we're getting ready to reign with him. Our perspectives in this life will change when we connect our temporal world to the eternal world and the eternal world that we'll spend with him. In the phrase of that old hymn, the things of this world will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and his grace. This is the great life, and I want to tell you something. There is nothing in this world that compares to it. If you're sitting here today and you are unfulfilled, and you've got this void inside of you, and you're trying to cram all this activity or learning or accomplishments or sex or drugs or achievement or money, and you're finding that no matter how much you put into that void, it's never getting full, I'm here to let you know that you can have a better life by letting Jesus Christ come in and to fill you and to turn you into a new person. It's a place of paradox. Instead of going for all those things for yourself, you give yourself away to God, and that's how you become fulfilled. Amen. There are people in this world, ladies and gentlemen, who are lost and dying and broken, and they're trying to stuff that void with everything they can, and they know intuitively inside themselves that it's not working, but they don't have the courage to face it. We need to be in relationships, yes, with each other, but we need to form relationships, deep relationships with people who don't know Jesus Christ. Sometimes I've toyed with the idea of doing a ministry at the bars at Champs on Friday night. Let's just go there and get to know people. I'm being somewhat facetious, but I'm not being somewhat facetious, right? Because if all of our relationships are here at church, then we're not being salt and light out in the real world. Well, you say I work with people, that's fine. I work with people too. But in my role, because of the power imbalance that I have in my role, I don't talk about Christ much. It's not fair to them. But we need to develop relationships with others that are very peer-oriented, where we can help them see that Jesus Christ is the answer for today. That Jesus Christ is the one who will fill you and heal you, but he will also require everything of you in order to do that. In a sense, it's free, you can have it, but in another sense, it will cost you everything you have. Sorry, I got off script there. I apologize, Katrina. Let me figure out where I'm at now. I meant in my notes. I am not geographically challenged, okay? Even though I may look like it, and white hair and all that. Here we go. Katrina, slide 34. Last week, Our stewardship question was this: will you allow God to write fully his laws into your mind and your heart? Our stewardship question this week is this: will you be a faithful steward who properly cares for God's entrustments and takes the time and effort to intimately know him? Will you say yes to God this morning, or will you hang on to your stuff? That's our challenge this morning. Disciples of Jesus Christ are faithful to God in stewarding all that he owns by disadvantaging themselves in order to advantage his kingdom. Let's pray. Father, I love you. I wish I loved you more. I want the great life, God. I want what you have for us. I want this church to have it. Father, I can just see this church becoming a soul-winning, on-fire church for you. And I understand, Father, that we need to become generous first. We have to become faithful in the small stuff, God, if we're going to be faithful in the big stuff. And my sense, God, is that you want to do an incredible work in the lives of us individually as well as corporately. You want to do those things in us that would unleash spiritual power and faithfulness to you. I'd love it, Father, if every week we had people coming to know you, not just here at church, but during the week. Father, I would love it if people were mighty in prayer and we were moving things in the spiritual realm. That when we prayed, we just knew we were touching your heart. And we knew we were doing things in the spiritual realm that we're not doing today. Father, that is what I ask for me. That's what I ask for every person here, those who are online. And I ask that for this church. This is no kidding stuff, people. This is real stuff. And Father, I ask that you would do a work in us that we cannot do in ourselves. In your name I pray. Amen.